Some people look at a CEO wrapped in luxury and think, well, that guy's got life figured out. They see the car in the driveway, the perfect house, the fat bank account, and assume wealth is a shield against any kind of pain. What no one shows is what happens after the meeting, when the suit goes back on the hanger and silence takes over the room. It almost sounds controversial to say it, but the loneliness of someone with a lot of money usually gets less empathy, as if power canceled their right to hurt. And that's exactly where a lot of stories of legacy start slipping off track, long before anyone notices. Daniel Montgomery was the picture of that paradox. Admired, a reference in the business world, yet waiting for Christmas the way you wait for a delayed flight in an empty airport. For 6 years, he'd spent the same night in the same way, swearing to himself he was fine celebrating alone. On the outside, there was a controlled arrogance, a firm posture, quick answers. On the inside, a heart tired of holding nothing but reports and awards. His house looked like something out of a movie set, but it was missing the most important sound of all, someone calling his name not out of interest, but affection. And the more wealth he stacked up, the further he felt from any kind of real humility. Daniel had always been the type of man people point at from a distance and say, "That guy made it." At 43, CEO of a fast-growing tech company, he carried a respected last name, a packed schedule, and enough wealth to buy almost anything except inner quiet. That Christmas Eve, his city outside glowed with lights and storefronts, but his house felt like a stage after the show, empty and echoing. The loudest sounds were the crackle of the fireplace and his own footsteps on the wooden floor. It is strange how so much power can live side by side with a heart that feels completely irrelevant the second the lights go out. He had built everything from scratch. Endless meetings, risky decisions, sleepless nights, contracts that changed the fate of entire companies. The arrogance of some colleagues said he was too cold for a family, but underneath, what really lived there was fear of getting close and being abandoned again. The expensive paintings on the walls didn't carry the smell of childhood. There were no crooked drawings stuck to the fridge, no kids' laughter running down the hallway. The clock moved toward yet another Christmas he'd spend pretending he was fine, while loneliness curled up next to him on the couch like an old companion. The whole house felt like a living reminder that material success doesn't to put an arm around your shoulder at the right time. For 6 years straight, Daniel had spent Christmas Eve the same way, eating dinner alone, answering emails no one had asked for, and pretending it was a choice. He told himself it was part of his legacy, that big names pay the price of loneliness in the name of work. But when the wine glass always faces the same empty chair, something inside you starts to ask if that's really what victory looks like. If, while you listen to the wind brushing against the windows, your heart also feels like it's asking for something beyond achievements, just take a breath for a second. And if you want to follow stories like this stories that poke at the most sensitive part of your soul, it's worth subscribing to the channel and walking with us on this different way of looking at wealth and life. Outside, snow fell slowly, like the world had hit the mute button. Daniel watched through the window as 2 figures crossed the street. A woman in a simple coat, carrying a covered baking dish, and a little girl clutching her hand. They weren't invited guests. They weren't clients. They weren't gala event people, just ordinary neighbors. The contrast between the wealth scattered around his house and the humble gesture knocking at his door was almost uncomfortable. His heart sped up not out of fear, but because he didn't know how to handle something money hadn't to put on his calendar. Sometimes the real turning point shows up just like that, unannounced, leaving wet boot prints on the entryway rug. When Sarah Bennett smiled and introduced herself, her voice carried a gentle kind of exhaustion, the kind you hear in someone who carries the world on their back and still tries to be kind. Emma, cheeks red from the cold, raised the tray of homemade cookies like she was offering treasure. The arrogance that so often surrounded Daniel in boardrooms didn't fit there. This was a moment of simple humility, of an open door on a freezing night. He mumbled, "You really didn't have to," which was just a clumsy way of hiding his shock that someone had thought of him without caring about his power. And for a moment, he realized that maybe the legacy missing from his life was the one where people remembered him as a person, not just as a CEO. Emma stared at him with the unfiltered curiosity kids had before they learn how to pretend. No small talk, no fear of titles or bank accounts, just a blunt, "You look sad," shot straight through his defenses in a way no negotiation ever had. That was where the wall around him first cracked, not with a big speech, but with a small, honest sentence. Surprised at his own reaction, Daniel heard himself say, "Come in, please. It's way too cold out there." He hadn't expected to open his house, much less his heart, but some encounters shove the story onto a different path, whether you're ready or not. And as they crossed the doorway, the air in the room seemed to brace itself for something he didn't know how to name yet. The living room, which had felt like a showroom from a magazine, started to shift the second the smell of hot chocolate spread through the air. Sarah pulled off her gloves, set them near the fireplace, and let out a small sigh, the kind that escapes after a long day at the hospital. As she stirred her mug, she told him she worked as a nurse on double shifts, trying to juggle bills, time with Emma, and the dream of owning a home someday. In that backdrop of quiet wealth, her humility seemed almost out of place, and yet it was exactly what made everything feel more human. Daniel listened in silence, realizing that for the first time in a long time, someone was talking to him without measuring their words against his power. Emma sat in an armchair far too big for her, legs swinging, taking everything in with wide-eyed wonder. She showed him a drawing she made of her mom with a giant heart in the center, explaining that, when I grow up, she wanted to take care of people just like Sarah did. There was no arrogance in that dream, only a pure desire to leave a legacy of care in the world. Something almost childlike tightened in Daniel's chest as he imagined what it would have been like to grow up with someone like Sarah nearby. With each burst of Emma's laughter, the house seemed to shrink, going from mansion to home for a few minutes at a time. The conversation itself was nothing extraordinary, and that's exactly why it was so powerful. They talked about shift schedules, overdue bills, how Emma loved when her mom brought leftover cupcakes from the hospital. Daniel realized he didn't have to impress anyone there. He just needed to be present, to listen, to answer, to let his corporate mask hang by the door. He felt like he'd been invited into something simple but rare, as if a quiet turning point was beginning right there, in the middle of steaming mugs. And without noticing, his heart was already taking a step toward the next Christmas that night was quietly setting up. The next morning, Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He went out to buy Christmas gifts himself, no assistant, no driver, no printed list. He walked the aisles of a store, looking at toys, books, paints, trying to imagine Emma's eyes lighting up as she opened each one. When he stopped in front of an art kit, he remembered the drawing with the giant heart she'd shown him the night before. That gift had nothing to do with flashy wealth and everything to do with encouragement, with legacy, with feeding a talent born in the humility of a curious little girl. For the first time, he was using his power to get something right that didn't fit on a spreadsheet. For Sarah, he chose a soft blue scarf, thinking of all the cold nights she left the hospital after long shifts. It wasn't expensive by his standards, but it carried respect and care, almost like a silent request that someone would start caring for her, too. When he arrived at their place for dinner, their small home was full of tiny details. A table set with care, a little Christmas tree covered in handmade ornaments, the smell of turkey in the oven mixed with laughter from the kitchen. Corporate arrogance stayed outside. Inside, humility ruled the kind that shares what little it has with genuine joy. That reversal of scenery made Daniel strangely grateful. Dinner was simple but full of life. overlapping conversations, Emma trying to tell 3 stories at once, board games where a CEO used to winning learned how to laugh at losing. Between sips of hot chocolate and bursts of laughter, he realized he was building memories no amount of money could ever buy. If, at some point, you've also experienced an encounter that quietly changed everything inside you, you can share it down in the comments. So often, one person's story is the mirror someone else needs. At the end of the night, as they watched a Christmas movie squeezed together on the same couch, Daniel felt like this could be the first chapter of a new kind of Christmas, and there was still so much left to happen after the tree lights went out. When the movie ended, the only light in the room came from the glow of the Christmas tree, and the only sound was Emma, soft breathing as she slept in Daniel's lap. He looked down at that little girl resting against his chest and felt a kind of responsibility that had nothing to do with spreadsheets or corporate power. Sarah, sitting beside him, gently pulled a blanket over her daughter with the kind of care that feels like a silent prayer. The wealth around them, the designer furniture, the sound system faded into the background behind a scene that was both tiny and enormous at the same time. For the first time in years, the silence in his house wasn't empty. It was peace. Sarah thanked him for the art kit, for the scarf, but most of all for the way he'd treated Emma all day. There was no flattery in her voice, no arrogance, no hidden agenda, just the sincere gratitude of a mother who knows when someone has truly seen her child. He took a deep breath before admitting that, in that simple evening, he'd felt something his money had never given him, a sense of belonging. The humility of confessing that material success hadn't filled his heart left him vulnerable, but also lighter. It was as if an internal turning point was reshuffling his priorities without asking for permission. Then Sarah spoke with the calm firmness of someone who sees pain every day in hospital corridors. It's never too late to build a new life, Daniel. Sometimes it starts on a Christmas you never expected. Her words kept echoing in his mind, like someone had flipped on a light in a forgotten hallway. He thought about his legacy, about the marks he'd leave behind beyond buildings and contracts, and realized this story might still be on its very first page. As he lifted Emma in his arms to take her to the guest room, something inside him was already walking toward a future that hadn't been written yet. In the months that followed, Daniel's routine started spinning on a different axis. The expensive car in the garage now drove Emma to school, picked Sarah up after her shifts, showed up with pizza on random Tuesdays just to break up their exhaustion. His once silent house began filling with drawings taped to the fridge, half-finished mugs left on tables, laughter echoing down the hallway. Emma started calling him Uncle Daniel, and he felt a new kind of power, not the kind from the boardroom, but the kind that comes from making a kid feel safe. It was like a new kind of wealth was being born, measured in presence instead of numbers. Over time, tougher news crept in. Rent going up, bills stacking, a harsh warning that the landlord might take the place back. Sarah tried to hold on to the humility of someone who's always found a way, but her eyes betrayed the fear of losing the little she'd managed to build. Daniel saw the contrast between the arrogance of a market that doesn't to forgive and the fragile strength of a mom trying to protect her daughter. He could have just helped with money and moved on, but he knew that wouldn't fix the emptiness of belonging that lived inside him too. The real turning point would have to go beyond a check. One quiet night, he took a deep breath and made the offer that would change everyone's legacy. He suggested that Sarah and Emma move into his home, not as temporary guests, but as people starting to build a family, brick by brick, gesture by gesture. Sarah hesitated, afraid it would feel like charity, until she heard Daniel say, with a gentle firmness, "This isn't charity. It's family taking care of each other." There was humility in his voice and a kind of love you can't buy or force. And as they traded that look, half doubt, half hope, none of them had any idea how far this decision would take each of their hearts. The move didn't come with big trucks or interior designers. It began with simple boxes, worn-out books, and stuffed animals that had been hugged 1,000 times. When Sarah and Emma walked through Daniel's front door carrying their things, the polished world of wealth gained something money can't sell: the marks of real life. The immaculate office gained a cup full of colored pencils. The hallway gained a pair of tiny sneakers, forgotten in the corner, only to be worn again the next day. Daniel realized his power was no longer just in million-dollar decisions, but in daily choices to give up space, adjust schedules, and learn how to share his once sacred silence. In that first week, everything was new. Shared breakfasts, sticky notes left on the fridge, laughter floating from the kitchen while he was still finishing a video call. Sarah, with her quiet humility, tried not to get in the way, almost asking permission to exist, tidying every corner like a guest afraid to overstay. Sometimes she'd look at the walls and wonder if this place could ever really be home. Daniel noticed those glances, and in small ways tried to say without words, "You belong here." The arrogance he wore like armor at work felt, inside that house, like a suit that no longer fit. Emma, meanwhile, adapted the way only kids can. In a matter of days, she'd picked her favorite spot on the couch, claimed a corner of the living room as her art zone, and stretched out on the rug to listen to stories. One night, she asked Daniel what Christmas had been like when he was a kid. He took a breath before telling her about a distant father, a sick mother, and a house with lights but no real warmth. Listening to him, Sarah understood that this wasn't a charity at all. It was a turning point all three of them desperately needed. Without realizing it, they were starting to stitch together a new legacy, sewn with memories that were still being created. As time went on, the shine of new gave way to the real test of living together. Daniel learned that wealth doesn't stop the alarm from going off at dawn when Emma has a school performance or Sarah needs a ride for a night shift. One evening he came home exhausted and found toys scattered across the living room, crumbs on the couch, dried paint on the dining table. His old arrogance, used to everything being in its proper place, almost snapped. He stood there for a moment, staring at the new chaos in his carefully ordered world, and realized that the power to build a family meant accepting mess and improvisation too. He chose to swallow the complaint, roll up his sleeves, and pick up a cloth instead. Not everything, though, could be fixed with a deep breath. Some nights, Sarah felt like a burden, uncomfortable watching Daniel pay bills she could never dream of handling alone. Her beautiful humility sometimes hurt her, making her shrink back right when he wanted her to take up more space. They had their first real argument over it, right there in the kitchen, between dishes in the sink and a pot still on the stove. She insisted she didn't want to be another charity project. He, hurt, asked if she really saw him as nothing more than that. It was a hard turning point, the kind that leaves the house in thick silence for a while. That night, while Emma slept unaware of any tension, Daniel sat alone in the dark living room, the only light coming from the tree. He thought about his legacy and realized that for years he used money as a way to control everything, including feelings. Now he'd have to learn a new kind of humility that doesn't show up on a bank statement. Listening, yielding, apologizing. The next morning, he made breakfast before heading out, left a simple note on the table. "I don't want to buy your peace, Sarah. I want to build ours." Then went to work with a tight chest. A few weeks later, life slid into that strange rhythm where everything feels normal, until something yanks the rug out from under you. At the company, Daniel faced intense pressure from the board to cut costs in areas he considered essential, including partnerships with hospitals and employee health benefits. The old reflexes of wealth and power pushed him toward the cold logic of numbers. But now, every spreadsheet had a face. He thought of Sarah, of people like her, worn out in hospital corridors. The arrogance that once would have had him signing off without a second thought no longer fit as easily. He left the meeting with a clear sense that if he gave in, he'd be betraying something bigger than his job title. That night, he found Sarah coming home from a brutal shift, her face stamped with one of those days when nothing feels like enough. She told him about patients with no insurance, about families hanging by a thread, dependent on the scraps of an overstraying system. As she talked, stirring her tea, Daniel connected the pain she saw up close with the decisions he made from above. The humility of just listening, without interrupting, forced him to face the size of the responsibility that came with his power. It wasn't about quarterly profit anymore. It was about the kind of legacy he'd leave in lives that would never know his name, but would feel the impact of his choices. The next day, he walked back into the boardroom with a different posture. Instead of presenting a list of cuts, he put forward a bold idea: redirect money from vanity projects into a health fund, guaranteeing real care for employees and their families in critical situations. Some directors rolled their eyes, accusing him of being too emotional. The old corporate arrogance tried to push him back into his former mold. But he stayed firm, holding that turning point with data, long-term vision, and something they didn't expect: a human conviction that was very hard to buy. When the project was finally approved grudgingly, in some corners, Daniel felt his wealth begin to touch the world in a way that would still make sense when he was gone. As the health fund started to actually work, its impact showed up in stories, not just in reports. Employees who'd been putting off exams could finally get them done. Entire families were taken care of in crucial moments, and word spread through the company like a quiet rumor of hope. But along with the praise came the weight of threatened wealth. Some investors started questioning his decisions, saying Daniel was too emotional, and that the company existed to make profit, not save the world. One tense afternoon, they called an emergency meeting to review the project and, between the lines, to decide if he was still the right CEO. The old arrogance of the market hammered at the door, reminding him that in there, power always came with a price tag. That same week, life decided to test him from another angle. Emma fell on the school playground, hit her head, and was rushed to the hospital. When Daniel got the call, he was standing outside the conference room, about to walk into that critical meeting with the board. The executive floor hallway smelled like coffee and tension as the phone shook in his hand, and he heard Sarah's choked voice on the other end. In that instant, every presentation, every chart, every prediction of future wealth shrank next to the fear of losing the little girl who called him uncle. The turning point didn't come in the shape of a contract, but as a choice: stay and defend his power, or run to be with the family he said he wanted to build. He glanced through the glass wall, saw the directors settling into their chairs with their folders of numbers, and made a decision the old Daniel never would have had the courage to make. He stepped into the room just long enough to say, with a steady voice, that he needed to go to the hospital, and that any discussion about the health fund would happen later, with me at the table, or with another CEO if you prefer. There was no arrogance in his tone, just certainty. On the way to the hospital, his heart pounded harder than it ever had in any billion-dollar negotiation. When he arrived, he found Sarah's hands shaking, her eyes lost between fear and guilt, and Emma undergoing tests in the very wing partly sustained by the brand-new fund he'd almost watched be dismantled. Right there, the legacy he was building gained a face, the smell of antiseptic, and the relentless beep of a heart monitor. Hours later, the doctor said Emma was going to be okay, but the scare had stripped away every mask. Sarah looked at Daniel with tears in her eyes and told him that if he had chosen the meeting instead of the hospital, she'd never be able to see him the same way again. It wasn't a threat. It was the raw truth. Her words sank deep, not as an accusation, but as a mirror. The humility of hearing that without defending himself showed just how much he changed since those Christmases he spent eating alone. In that small room surrounded by equipment partly paid for by the fund they tried to cut, Daniel finally understood that his power only made sense when it served the people he loved and a whole lot of people he'd never meet. In the days that followed, the calls from the board rolled in, along with cool emails and rescheduled meetings. Some wanted to corner him. Others spoke in vague terms about reviewing his leadership, as if he were a piece of equipment they could just swap out. Daniel walked back into the boardroom with a different kind of calm. Instead of justifying himself, he drew a clear line. The health fund would not be dismantled. If that meant giving up the title, he was ready. But he wouldn't sign anything that erased the legacy he was building inside the company and in that hospital wing. The arrogance of a few directors tried to mock him, calling it expensive romanticism. He answered with numbers, with results, and most of all with a firmness that didn't come from ego, but from a conscience at peace. The turning point was quiet. Not one of them wanted to be remembered as the person who officially pulled the plug on a project that was already saving lives. Sometime later, Daniel chose to step out of the spotlight. He stayed on as a major shareholder and strategic mentor, but passed the CEO title to new leadership, committed to that same human vision. At home, life moved at a different pace. Emma grew up feeling safe. Sarah laughed more easily. The old, empty mansion now had the sound of pots clanging in the kitchen, drawings spread across the table, and the smell of simple food filling the air. One ordinary evening, while they were packing bags of groceries and little notes for neighbors who lived alone, the doorbell rang. Outside stood an older man, tired, holding a piece of mail that had been delivered to the wrong address. Emma ran to the door, and with the same natural ease that had once changed Daniel's life, invited him in, even if it's just for some hot chocolate. Daniel and Sarah looked at each other and smiled in silence. They understood. This was their real legacy. The wealth was still there, but the greatest power in that house now was using their hearts to do for others what one little girl once did for a lonely CEO. Sometimes, the most uncomfortable part of this story isn't what happens to Daniel. It's what it reveals about the life of the person watching. There are a lot of people who, on the outside, look like they made it. They work nonstop, solve everything, hold their family together, pay bills for half the world. But on the inside, they eat dinner alone with their own exhaustion. Maybe you don't have the same wealth in numbers, but you carry a kind of power over your routine that, without noticing, keeps pushing affection to later. And while that happens, the Sarahs and Emmas in your life knock on your door every day, asking not for performance, but for presence. It's worth asking yourself, in what moments have you chosen the meeting over the hospital, the title over the hug, the arrogance of handling everything alone over the humility of admitting you need someone too? Sometimes the big turning point doesn't show up as a giant miracle, but as a simple decision to send a message, go home earlier, or genuinely listen to the person next to you. What kind of legacy do you want to leave for the people who matter? Will they remember what you bought, or how you showed up when their world was falling apart? If this story touched something inside you, don't let it fade when the video ends. Think of one person who is your chosen family, someone who might not even know it yet. Maybe it's time to knock on someone's door, or to finally open yours to someone who's been trying to get close. And if you want to walk with us through other stories that stir this deeper place in your soul, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss the next narratives that will remind you, again and again, that true wealth is turning the power you have into care for the people walking beside you.